Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me. And yes, I was an anti-submarine warfare officer, but we call them principal warfare officers these days, and they do other things, and I did actually run a gunnery firing once. Once. But they were 5-inch guns, so you can't complain. Right, Naval Gunfire Support at Gallipoli. As you've already heard, Naval Gunfire Support at Gallipoli hasn't got a good press. Lord Kitchener, who before the landing had envisioned the Turks swept away by the Navy's guns, was soon expressing his disappointment with their effectiveness. Charles Bean was more explicit, claiming that Naval Artillery was useless, the ships being unable to fire over impossible angles at undiscoverable targets. Now, because naval guns were optimised for use against other ships, Gallipoli's topography undoubtedly posed difficulties. Often only the outer edges of an enemy position were exposed, rendering the relatively flat trajectory of naval shells far less effective. Fuses too were inadequate, high explosive shells being regularly defeated by the need to achieve a steep angle of impact. Then there were the challenges of identifying targets, as we've heard, communicating with observers ashore and in the air, and applying corrections in a moving gun platform. Although anchoring might improve the ship's accuracy, smaller warships in particular were unwilling to stop within range of active enemy artillery. And this photograph here with the ship making smoke isn't coming from its funnels. This is a destroyer that was hit by Turkish artillery. As if these difficulties were not enough, they were compounded by the narrow gap between the opposing trenches, again we've heard of, shortage of equipment, underpowered seaplanes and fragile wireless sets. Yet despite all these problems, the story was never wholly negative. And any balanced account can't ignore either Naval Gunfire's specific contribution to the campaign or to the advance of joint warfare techniques more generally. With the Western Front retaining priority, the Dardanelles expedition was always seriously undergunned. Hence, throughout the campaign, Allied commanders had little option but to rely on warships for adequate firepower. That this could be done throughout the campaign's duration already marks a significant achievement. But arguably of more long-term importance were the lessons learnt. The novel situation facing the commanders ashore and at sea needs to be stressed. The campaign involved the largest British amphibious venture in more than a century and called for unprecedented levels of joint cooperation. Now, this isn't an easy task at the best of times, but when you have two services that embraced entirely different cultures, traditions and terminology, you had a recipe for disaster. And I found an interesting letter when doing some research for this that dated from December 1915, so right at the end of the campaign, and we're talking about the problems with terminology. If you know anything about the Navy, you know it works in watches, and it calls those watches certain names. Well, as late as December 1915, a cruiser captain had to apologise to the Army for leaving his task early because the Army had asked for the gunfire support in the morning. And the Army meant before midday, the Navy read that as being from 4 to 8. That's the sort of problems you get when you don't speak the same language. At the same time, new technologies were proliferating, bringing untried equipment and unexpected problems. For example, broad area networking, and you saw a similar diagram to this earlier, which links firing ships, aerial spotters and forces ashore, performed poorly, due largely to a lack of common doctrine, inexperience, and the weakness of individual systems. But the fundamental lesson wasn't that the concept was flawed, it's that there were challenges that needed to be met and overcome. Furthermore, there were marked successes for Naval Gunfire Support at Gallipoli. Enemy trenches were initially very shallow, only around knee-high, making them vulnerable to airbursts. If you visit the War Memorial and its latest Great War exhibition, you'll see there a shrapnel ball fired by HMS Queen Elizabeth into Battleship Hill, named Battleship Hill because of their fire support. It's about the size of a 50-cent piece, this thing. Well, Queen Elizabeth was a battleship. It carried 8 15-inch guns, and each shrapnel shell held 15,000 of those shrapnel balls. An Australian colonel observed after the landing that just one shell from Queen Elizabeth had wiped out a whole Turkish regiment. Ottoman records agree on the heavy losses sustained during their early counterattacks, and afterwards they made no further attempts to advance by day over ground in view of the supporting warships. Moreover, even when ineffective against deep fortifications, naval artillery still ensured that the enemy's heavy guns were suppressed, their logistics hindered, and the reserves disrupted. As General von Sanders admitted later, the artillery effect of the hostile battleships constituted a support of extraordinary power for the landing army. Indeed, the whole naval presence was of immense reassurance to Allied troops. Little wonder then that the loss of the battleship HMS Triumph to a U-boat on the 25th of May was regarded by the Anzacs as being like an old friend gone. And if the Royal Navy's official history is to be believed, then the Australian troops all volunteered to donate a month's pay towards the battleship's salvage. Now, I note that Charles Bean doesn't mention that story in his volume. But anyway, the subsequent loss of HMS Majestic to another torpedo and the departure of all battleships to protected harbours was no less heartening to the enemy. As General Hamilton reported, the temporary withdrawal of our battleships has altered the position to our disadvantage. While not of the highest importance materially, this factor carries great moral weight. Now, that the material effect was not intolerable had much to do with the fleet's adaptability. While awaiting more anti-submarine nets and the new monitors fitted with heavy guns, battleship guns, howitzers and anti-torpedo bulges, that's the shape seen here, the daily task of providing flanking fire to the forces ashore fell to destroyers. Fortunately, procedural improvements had already increased the effectiveness of their smaller guns. By the time of the August offensives, 3 squadrons of cruisers, monitors and destroyers operated off the peninsula. For direct support, Anzac commanders had access to 9 warships, which together mounted 70 guns, ranging from 4.7-inch howitzers up to 14-inch battleship guns, which were on the monitors. Despite ammunition shortages, Turkish reports admit that these guns effectively pounded their high ground, causing a great part of their casualties. Experience also brought improvements in readiness and accuracy. Using marker buoys, aerial photography and better maps, aiming points, ranges and deflections were registered onto any position on which fire might be required by the Army, meaning that indirect fire could be opened at very short notice. By December, the land forces attributed the rapid success of an attack at Cape Helles mainly to naval artillery, concluding that the chief point is that cooperation has now become a practical reality. The level of cooperation in both... Sorry, I see what you mean. Yeah. The level of cooperation in both attack and defence being far ahead of anything contemplated at home. And that's Bacanti off Anzac. Now, for today's ADF, Gallipoli's legacy should not be seen simply in terms of our casualties. As Admiral de Robeck, the naval commander, highlights here, the experience would directly inform the development of doctrine, techniques and equipment. It thereby paved the way for the succession of joint operations that brought victory in 1945 and that still provide the foundation of our modern ideas of maritime power projection. Now, notwithstanding de Robeck's fine words, I'll finish with a report from a Turkish lieutenant colonel dated the 9th of August. And this demonstrates just how accurate naval gunfire could be. Now, this is a Turkish report. Pleased by the successful outcome of battle, I asked for my tent to be erected on Teki Tebi, which is overlooking Suvla Bay, where all the battlefield could be viewed for the night. I ordered a coffee to relieve my fatigue and sat down beside my portable table. Just as I started to enjoy my coffee, an explosion very close by brought down the tent. Since the battle had gone quiet, we could not understand it at first. This was followed a few minutes later by a second explosion a little further away. We observed a balloon flying from one of the ships in the harbour and understood that the tent had become a target for Naval Artillery. Since the tent was destroyed and the target now gone, the firing stopped. We got through the danger with my horse being blown apart and one soldier wounded, but were compelled to find a safer observation post. Now, a first shot hit, even today, is pretty good. Thank you.